This is Maya Ellison. Welcome back to Still Unanswered. Today, we return to Austin, but not the Austin you think you know, the dusty, gaslit capital of the 1880s, a city of about 17,000 people, brick storefronts down Congress Avenue, and a larger, louder world pressing in. We're talking about a year when sleep meant danger, when people who ran households, mostly Black women, were being attacked in their beds. The papers would later call the series the Servant Girl Murders. The violence began in late 1884 and kept Austin in a state of fear through 1885. It is a case that raises questions we still wrestle with. Who was allowed to be fully mourned? Who was rushed into a courtroom? And why did the terror end with as little closure as it began? I'm joined by Dr. Calvin Rhodes, historian of Reconstruction and Post-Reconstruction Texas. Calvin, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Maya. It's good to be here. This case, it's heavy. It's one of those moments where the violence of the past reaches across time and asks us to look, really look, at who we considered worthy of protection and why.
Right. Let's start with the city. Paint it for us, Calvin. What was Austin like in 1884-85? Why could a serial predator operate the way he did?
Austin, then, was a small capital, around 17,000 people. It was shifting from a frontier town into a modern city. You had paved sections, sure, but lots of unpaved streets, alleys, and service yards. Importantly, the social geography mattered. Black residents, often newly emancipated or children of formerly enslaved families, did a lot of domestic labor. Cooks, laundresses, servants, frequently sleeping in small cabins or outbuildings behind a white family's main house. Those cabins were vulnerable. Poor lighting, patchy police patrols, a general worldview that treated those quarters as somehow separate from regular life, all of that created conditions where an attacker could move through the city at night with relative ease.
So the physical city and the social city both made the attacks possible.
Exactly. And policing was rudimentary. There were a few officers on foot or horseback, no fingerprints, no DNA, limited forensic practice. If you were in a servant's cabin behind a larger home, you were physically close to a white household, and yet often legally and socially invisible.
That invisibility shows up in coverage, too. The early murders, many of them Black women, were treated differently than the later white victims. We'll get to that pattern, but first I want to walk listeners through the timeline. Take us from the earliest attacks to that December night that changed everything.
Okay, the arc begins with a series of assaults in mid-1884. Stabbings, a woman hit with a smoothing iron, attacks that didn't make a huge splash in the papers. Then, on December 30-31, 1884, Molly Smith, about 25, a Black cook, was struck in her bed, an axe or heavy implement to the head, dragged outside and left naked in the snow. That death, in retrospect, fits a pattern. Nighttime attacks on sleeping domestic workers with a blunt instrument, sexual assault, and mutilation. Over the next year, through May, August, September, another sequence of killings and savage assaults occurred. Eliza Shelley in May, Irene Cross later that same month, the abduction and murder of 11-year-old Mary Ramey in August, the double attack on Gracie Vance and Orange, Washington in September. Then, on December 24, 1885, two white women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, were attacked in different parts of town within hours of each other. That night brought national attention and a shift in public urgency.
We'll go case by case, but listeners should know up front, the killer, if one single man was responsible, often attacked with an axe or household weapon. pretended to strike while victims slept, dragged them outside, and mutilated them. There were at least 8 people killed and several gravely injured. But I want to pause on Mary Ramey for a second, because her case is one of the most chilling, and it exposes the sadism in this pattern.
Mary was 11. She and her mother, Rebecca Ramey, lived in servant quarters. One night, the killer attacked. Rebecca was left unconscious with severe head injuries. Mary was taken to an outbuilding and raped. Reports say an iron rod was driven through her ear into her skull. This ear mutilation, or insertion of objects into the ears, shows up again in other cases. It becomes, for many researchers, a kind of signature behavior. It's grotesque, and it tells us the violence was not merely utilitarian. It was ritualistic, disturbing in a way that goes beyond simple assault.
When I read those descriptions, head split nearly in half, almost beaten into a jelly, iron rods through ears, my first reaction is the obvious one. The brutality is unimaginable. But then I also think, how many of these victims were reduced to job titles in the record? Molly, Eliza, Irene, often just first names, called servant girls. That's an injustice in itself.
Yes, the press and the legal system often recorded black victims with minimal identity, servant girl or just Molly, while white victims suddenly became Mrs. Hancock or Eula Phillips with full backstory. It's not just a failure of compassion, it's a structural failure that affects investigation, resource allocation, and historical memory.
Let's talk about the Vance Washington double murder, because it marks an escalation. 4 people were in the cabin. The killer attacked them all, killed Orange Washington as well as Gracie Vance, and injured 2 others. Neighbors heard the commotion. A man was seen running toward Wheatville. This is one of the scenes where footprints matter, right?
Right. Crime scenes were photographed occasionally, but physical evidence was primarily footprints, blood splatter, mostly rudimentary. At several scenes, investigators found bare footprints in mud and blood. One print was especially notable. It suggested someone missing a small toe. That detail would later link to a suspect. But remember, forensic technique was primitive, and comparisons were visual and anecdotal, not scientific.
Which leads us to the big question everyone wants to hear about: Nathan Elgin. He's the man many modern historians point to as the most plausible suspect. Give us who he was and why his name matters.
Nathan Elgin was a young black cook, about 19, from East Austin, what people called Wheatville. He knew the city's streets and service yards. The strongest piece of circumstantial evidence tying him to the killings is this. In February 1886, he was shot and later died after a saloon incident. When his body was examined, it was noted he was missing a small toe on his right foot. Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby later compared casts and impressions and told a court that Elgin's foot matched the crime scene footprints. Hornsby also argued the murder stopped after Elgin's death. Those 2 pieces, missing toe and the timing of the cessation, are the core of the argument for Elgin as the servant girl annihilator.
But there are limits. No confession, no DNA, no direct modern forensic link. And the period's biases complicate everything. Calvin, as a historian, how do you weigh that circumstantial case against the limits?
Carefully. The circumstantial case is strong in pattern. Victims concentrated in East Austin and downtown, signature mutilations, bare footprints that seem to match a missing toe, and an abrupt halt to the murders after Elgin's death. But we must not overclaim. Elgin's violent temper and the saloon incident fit an image of someone capable of violence, but the evidence, by modern standards, would be viewed as inadequate. There was no systematic fingerprinting, no chain of custody, and no baseline understanding of serial crime patterns. That said, from a historical standpoint, Elgin is a plausible primary suspect. He is the only person with both physiological linkage, missing toe, and a proximate violent episode that coincides with the murder's end.
Listeners, I want to be clear. Even today, many of us, historians, true crime researchers, stop at plausible, not proven. There are also eyewitness descriptions in the contemporary papers that are contradictory. Some people said the attacker was white, some said dark-skinned, some even described a man in a Mother Hubbard dress. Why did the eyewitness accounts vary so wildly?
Fear and darkness distort perception, and you layer on racial bias and panic. People were terrified, running to their windows at odd hours, trying to catch glimpses in lamplight. Under those conditions, different witnesses can see entirely different things and still be telling the truth as they experienced it. Add to that the period's racism. Some accounts tried to plead for reassurance by portraying the killer as other, a drifter, an outsider, sometimes even suggesting supernatural explanations. The chaotic eyewitness testimony makes a careful reconstruction difficult.
And then the media. The city didn't become a national story until 2 white women were attacked on Christmas Eve, right? That's when the New York Times and others called Austin a city under siege by a cunning madman. What does that shift tell you, Calvin?
It reveals priorities. Black victims could be shocking in isolated reports, but they rarely move the national press. When the killer attacked 2 white women, respectable, married, on the same night, a kind of moral panic seized news outlets. The attacks on Hancock and Phillips transformed the narrative from street crime in the colored quarters to a monstrous predator stalking respectable homes. Resources, outrage, and legal focus escalated. Tragically, that racialized ramping of attention meant some early victims were effectively sidelined in investigative priority and public memory.
Moses Hancock and James Phillips, the husbands, were both tried, but with very different outcomes. Moses Hancock was acquitted. James Phillips was convicted despite forensic evidence, or lack of it, suggesting he didn't match the prints. Walk us through those trials and why justice looked so different in each.
Moses Hancock faced charges largely because the public story of a husband murdering his wife was familiar and acceptable. However, the evidence didn't hold up. Moses had defense lawyers who argued the servant girl motive didn't fit domestic homicide. He was acquitted. James Phillips's case is a different horror. During his trial, the prosecution leaned on character witnesses and alleged jealous threats he'd made against Eula. There was a demonstration where Phillips's feet were inked and printed on the courtroom floor. The prints didn't match the crime scene, but jurors seemed swayed by motive and moral condemnation, Eula's alleged infidelity and James's temper. He was convicted of second-degree murder. Many historians see Phillips's conviction as a miscarriage of justice driven by a moral frame rather than serious forensic analysis.
So Phillips may have been convicted because he fit a narrative people wanted to believe. Jealous husband kills straying wife, rather than because of solid evidence linking him to the pattern of assaults. That feels infuriatingly familiar.
It is. It's a recurring pattern in criminal cases, historically and today. Narrative can overwhelm nuance, and systemic bias helps decide which narratives will stick.
Let's get back to the bodies of evidence. If we could time travel and apply modern forensics, fingerprints, DNA, 3D scanning of casts, what could we realistically hope to learn? Is there any surviving evidence at all?
Most original artifacts, clothing, floorboards, even some casts, have been lost, destroyed, or dispersed through private collections. If some evidence survived, say a preserved cast of a footprint or a scrap of clothing, theoretically you could extract DNA, use 3D imaging to compare foot anatomy, and apply geographic profiling to narrow a search area. But the reality is grim. The archival record is incomplete. So while modern methods could solve many historical mysteries in principle, here they may be constrained by the simple fact that the physical trail is gone.
Which brings us to a broader question you often ask students, Calvin. How do we remember cases like this, violent, unresolved, and marked by racial injustice, without turning them into lurid myth?
We remember by naming the victims and restoring their lives. We contextualize. We resist sensational nicknames as substitutes for people's identities. It's telling that the phrase servant girl annihilator, popularized later by O. Henry and later writers, helps sell a story but also flattens details. It implies the killer annihilated servant girls as a type, anonymizing them. Restoring their names, Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Susan Hancock, Eula Phillips, and telling what we can about their families, work, and communities returns their humanity to the center.
Let me read a short passage from an 1885 paper describing a death, the kind of language that made readers shiver and, I think, distance themselves from the victims at once. The monstrous assassin crept into the sleeping abode and laid low with merciless blows, her head almost beaten to a jelly. The paper is reveling in gore while saying nothing about the woman's life beyond servant or mother. That's the dehumanization you described.
And the gore is a way to titillate readers. It's news as theater. But when coverage treats victims purely as spectacle, it reduces the public's sense of obligation. If the story had insisted, this is Mary Ramey, 11 years old, daughter, neighbor, who helped her mother at the wash, maybe the outrage and the allocation of resources would have been different earlier.
Listeners, I want to pause. You may hear how careful Calvin is about claims. We're operating within archival limits. There is a modern body of research, Skip Hollandsworth's Texas Monthly piece, the ServantGirlMurders.com project, work by Kate Winkler-Dawson, that argues powerfully for Elgin as the likely killer, but also reminds us the case is unresolved. In a minute, we'll discuss motives and psychological profile, but before that, listeners, any reactions so far? Kelvin?
2 points I want to press. 1. The line between plausible and proven matters because it shapes how families remember and how institutions are held accountable. 2. The racial dimensions here are not side issues. They structure every institutional response. We can't separate forensic questions from social context.
Agreed. Let's talk psychology. If we imagine a single perpetrator, what does the pattern tell us about his motives or mind?
Modern profiling would likely categorize this offender in an anger retaliatory category, someone who directs rage at women, often sexualizes the violence, escalates in brutality, and operates close to home. The choice of victims, women in vulnerable domestic positions, suggests both accessibility and symbolic target. These were women who kept households and were physically close to white families, yet were socially marginalized. The insertion of objects into ears and facial mutilation suggests a ritual component. Overkill signals intense rage, possibly sexual pathology mixed with control fantasies. The escalation, early assaults in 1884, then multiple killings in 1885, fits the pattern of a killer testing boundaries, becoming bolder.
And as you said earlier, Elgin as a cook would have used knives, been strong, and had knowledge of floor plans and where people slept. The missing toe matching footprint casts is the single physical thread tying one man to many scenes.
Yes, but again, missing toe equals suspect equals conclusion only when you accept a chain of assumptions that may have been shaky then and are impossible to verify now. But from a social and criminal logic perspective, Elgin checks many boxes. He's not a perfect fit in every detail, no suspect ever is, but he's arguably the most coherent suspect we have.
There are other theories, multiple killers, gangs, even speculative Jack the Ripper links. What do you think of those?
The gang theory arises because some witnesses described more than one man. It's plausible that others might have joined or copied attacks. The Jack the Ripper link is mostly sensational and lacks evidence. Geographically and victimologically, it's not a neat fit. The multiple killer idea is worth considering, but the signature elements, ear insertions, night attacks on sleeping domestic workers argue for at least a dominant perpetrator shaping the pattern.
So, ambiguous, but likely one central actor, maybe with occasional help or imitators. Now, let's fast forward. What happened after Elgin's death in February 1886? The murders stopped. Sheriff Hornsby publicly suggested the prince matched Elgin and that violence ceased after his death. But there was no formal closure, right?
Correct. There was no definitive trial or conviction of Elgin for the murders. The official stop in violence, Hornsby's testimony about footprint matches, and Elgin's death live in the historical record, but they don't constitute the kind of closure we demand now. Families were left with grief and no legal finding that matched their experience.
And we should acknowledge, too, that the story is often told through a lurid title, Servant Girl Annihilator, a phrase popularized by O. Henry and later sensationalism. That title sells headlines, but erases people. Calvin, how do we ethically retell this story for a modern audience?
Start with the victims, not the villain. Use names. Contextualize the social and racial landscape. Avoid gratuitous gore and prioritize questions about justice. Who was protected? Who was ignored? Who was convicted and why? Place the case in a larger pattern of how marginalized lives have been historically undervalued by institutions. That's how we make it not just a lurid tale, but a lesson.
And what about the ongoing relevance? Why does the Servant Girl case matter in 2026?
Because it's an early, stark example of how race, class, media, and policing intersect to produce unequal protection and unequal remembrance. It's one of the earlier American serial killer cases, yes, but more importantly, it serves as a mirror. Who we fear when violence crosses class or racial lines, whose suffering triggers national outrage, and how legal systems can be rushed into narratives that satisfy social anxieties rather than truth.
We've covered the timeline, victims, suspects, the forensic limits, and the social frame. Before we close, I want to let you say, Calvin, what you wish every listener would take away from this episode.
I'd want listeners to hold two ideas at once. First, the case remains unsolved in the sense that no court definitively named a killer for all these murders. Second, even if we believe, on balance, that Nathan Elgin is the most plausible perpetrator, that doesn't erase the systemic failure that made it easier for such murders to continue for months and for victims to be treated as less than whole people. Memory and justice are not the same. We must restore names and insist on humane, equitable investigations in every era.
Name them. Remember them. That's the work we try to do. For anyone who wants to dig deeper, the ServantGirlMurders.com project is invaluable. Skip Hollandsworth's Texas Monthly piece, Capital Murder, brought renewed attention. Kate Winkler-Dawson's reporting foregrounds the racial dynamics. We'll include links in the episode notes. Calvin, any final thought?
Only this. When we say still unanswered, it's not a tease. It's an obligation. Those unanswered questions, who was truly responsible? Why were investigations shaped the way they were? Why did certain victims matter more than others? Shouldn't let us off the hook. They should demand more careful remembrance.
Thank you, Calvin. Listeners, this story is heavy. If you're feeling unsettled, that's appropriate. These murders were brutal. The victims deserve that discomfort. Join us next week when we look at another cold case whose answers may lie in overlooked archives. If you found today's episode meaningful, please consider supporting Still Unanswered so we can keep paying for archival access and the research that restores names to history. And
Maya, one last brief note.
yes?
Be sure to tell listeners that historical research is always evolving. New documents turn up, a footnote here, a parish register there. Small things can shift our understanding. So the unsolved tag might change, but the work of being attentive to victimhood and context is constant.
Good call. Okay. This episode is from Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Susan Hancock, Eula Phillips, and all the lives reduced in the record to a sensational phrase. I'm Maya Ellison. Thanks, Calvin. And thank you for listening. Soft outro music begins. Still Unanswered.